Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is Abraham Lincoln, Part 18. Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrenders at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. We stopped last time early 1865. On January 31st, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was passed by Congress abolishing slavery. So this was a big deal, making slavery illegal. Big celebration in the North. On February 1st, General William Tecumseh Sherman, who'd had his famous march to the sea and through Georgia, he headed north from Savannah, Georgia, through South Carolina. And of course, South Carolina is where the Confederate States of America started, and the secession of the South started, was the hotbed of secession. And there was a lot of Union troops involved in destruction in South Carolina to try to destroy the morale of the South so that they would surrender. There was a need to end Confederacy resistance. General Robert E. Lee still hoped at this time that the North would tire of the war and the Southern states, the Confederate states, could achieve their independence. Petersburg, Virginia, had been under siege since June of 1864, the longest siege in American history. And Petersburg was the key to sustaining Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, because of 5 railroads and connecting roads which came through Petersburg. Regarding passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution and getting enough votes in Congress, they had to have 2/3 in the House and Senate. President Lincoln said, quote, "We are like whalers who have been long on a chase. We have at last got the harpoon into the monster, but we must now look how we steer, or with one flop of his tail he will send us all into eternity." Now, when they were working on the passage of the 13th Amendment, they were short on votes in the House of Representatives. Alexander Kofroth changed his vote from against to in favor of the 13th Amendment. And he said, quote, "If by my actions today I dig my political grave, I will descend into it without a murmur." 5 Democrats changed their vote, and that led to the amendment passing. And before the end of 1865, the amendment was ratified by 3/4 of the states, which made slavery illegal in the United States. Abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison spoke to a crowd celebrating the passage of the 13th Amendment in Boston, Massachusetts. Quote, "And to whom is the country more immediately indebted for this vital and saving amendment to the Constitution? Perhaps to any other man. I believe I may confidently answer, to the humble rail splitter of Illinois, to the presidential chain breaker for millions of the oppressed, to Abraham Lincoln." In February, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman and the Union Army arrived in South Carolina. The state where the Civil War started quickly fell to the Union troops. In February, General Sherman took Columbia, South Carolina. On February 17th, the state capital. And the American flag was restored over Fort Sumter on February 18th, of course, which was where the Civil War started. At this time, President Lincoln was depressed. John Yates Bell was a man scheduled for execution. He was involved in Confederate raids from Canada into the North, and he came from a prominent family in Virginia. And he had many supporters appealing to President Lincoln for clemency. And President Lincoln denied the appeal, and this John Yates Beale was executed. And he felt that he had to stand firm, that John Yates Beale deserved death for his crimes. But he was distressed by his death because of all the people who spoke to him, trying to save the life of their relative and friend. In February of 1865, there was a great debate in the South, and the question was, should the slaves be free to serve in the Confederate Army to help win the war? Confederate General Robert E. Lee thought it was a good idea. In March, the Confederate Congress passed a bill which involved the enlistment of black troops in the Confederate Army. On March 26th, there was a Confederate battalion in Richmond that had 3 white companies and 2 black companies. March 4th was President Lincoln's second inauguration day. He had been reelected, and he was going to be inaugurated for a second term. There was heavy security. There were sharpshooters on the tops of buildings because there had been threats against President Lincoln's life. The Illinois State Journal wrote, quote, "All honor to Abraham Lincoln, through whose honesty, fidelity, and patriotism those glorious results have been achieved." The Chicago Tribune wrote, quote, "Mr. Lincoln has slowly and steadily risen in the respect, confidence, and admiration of the people. There were many soldiers in Washington. Many African Americans were at the inauguration. The streets of Washington, D.C. were a sea of mud 10 inches deep." The day before his second inauguration, President Lincoln signed the Freedmen's Bureau Act, which provided land, labor contracts, medical care, and education for the freed slaves, the freed black Americans, who were called freedmen at this time, African Americans. There was so much rain in Washington on President Lincoln's inauguration day that the police reportedly ordered those who could not swim to stay on the sidewalks. At his inauguration, one reporter wrote, quote, "Washington was, as usual, all mud and marble, the grandest architecture on the continent and the dirtiest streets. Myriads of patriots were hopelessly enslaved in mud, whom no Emancipation Proclamation could set free." Regarding President Lincoln's second inaugural address, a reporter wrote, quote, "The most remarkable speech ever given by an American president." Frederick Douglass was at the inauguration, also John Wilkes Booth, a Shakespearean actor. The reports said that when President Lincoln began to give his speech, the sun broke through the clouds. And in his inaugural address, President Lincoln said, quote, "Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil," he's talking about slaves, "shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." The best words were, "with malice toward none, with charity for all." So you see, he was looking for the end of the war and reconciliation and friendship with the South, the southern states, and the southern people. Now, before he was inaugurated, Andrew Johnson, the new vice president, he was also inaugurated, and he appeared in. Apparently, he was drunk. Johnson had been sick, and he was drunk, and he spoke incoherently during his speech. He addressed each cabinet secretary by name in his speech, but he forgot the name of Gideon Welles. And he said during his speech, quote, "What's the name of the Secretary of the Navy?" So this was an embarrassing situation when Andrew Johnson was inaugurated as vice president. Regarding President Lincoln's inauguration on March 4th, 1865, Noah Brooks wrote, quote, "The sun, which had been obscured all day, burst forth in its unclouded meridian splendor, and flooded the spectacle with glory and light. The The newly completed Capitol Dome the construction had been done on that dome, topped by the Statue of Freedom. So the U.S. Capitol had been rebuilt, and the way it looks today. There was an Inauguration Day reception at the White House, and President Lincoln shook hands with more than 5,000 people. His secretary, John Hay, said, quote, that if, quote, the patent leather kid glove set did not yet appreciate President Lincoln because they, quote, know no more of him than an owl does of a comet, blazing into his blinking eyes. So he's saying that, yeah, he really respected President Lincoln, and a lot of people really had no idea what a great man he was. At this time, President Lincoln had signed an order which indicated that all slave marriages were legal, though without benefit of clergy, and the widows of black soldiers were entitled to full benefits as widows, and their orphans, and the orphans of black soldiers who died, the same benefits as white soldiers. Now, President Lincoln, their son, and his wife Mary, their oldest son Robert, did join the U.S. Army near the end of the war. He graduated from Harvard in 1864. Mary was worried that Robert would die in the war because they'd already lost two sons, their sons Eddie and Willie, who had died of sickness. Robert enlisted in January of 1865. He served with General Ulysses S. Grant. He was never exposed to danger. His work he did was to escort visitors to the Army of the Potomac from one place to another. So after as we said, after the inauguration, President Lincoln shook hands. Some say it was as many as 6,000 people at the White House in the East Room, and that included Frederick Douglass. And when they came together to shake hands, President Lincoln said to Douglass, quote, there is no man in the country whose opinion I value more than yours. Regarding President Lincoln's inaugural address, Frederick Douglass said, quote, Mr. Lincoln, that was a sacred effort. So these two men really respected each other. March 24th, President Lincoln visited General Grant at his headquarters at City Point, Virginia, and he visited the wounded troops there and made a special point to speak with the wounded Confederate soldiers who were also there. In March, General Grant was afraid that General Lee's army would escape and the war would continue for another year. They were trying to end the war. President Lincoln wanted the Confederate army to disarm and return to their homes without being punished. He wanted a return of the South to their allegiance to the Union. Now, the Confederate Army, according to J. Winnick, historian, was, quote, as formidable as any army ever assembled. And the men in the Confederate Army were driven by their reverence for Confederate General Robert E. Lee and their love for him. In late March, President Lincoln, his wife Mary, their son Tad made a trip to City Point, Virginia, to visit General Ulysses S. Grant. And President Lincoln was 5 miles from the front. Secretary Stanton feared for the president's life since he was near the war zone and sent a telegram to President Lincoln, and he said, quote, I hope you will remember General William Henry Harrison's advice to his men at Tippecanoe, Indiana, that they, quote, can see as well a little further off. Now, during the President Lincoln's visit with General Grant, he told a story about the Trent Affair, in which these Confederate troops or Confederate officials had been arrested by Union officials on a British ship, but then later released in order to avoid conflict with Great Britain. And President Lincoln said he felt like the sick man who was near death and wanted to reconcile with his enemy. And they met and reconciled, and there was goodwill. But then he said that if he recovered, the old grudge would stand. So he was still, angry with the British for their support and willingness to meet with Confederate leaders. The Union Army, as we get near the end of the war into March, late March and moving into April of 1865, the Union Army had cut off the supply routes and escape routes of General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. And Now, a meeting with General Sherman and President Lincoln, Sherman said about Lincoln, quote, "Of all the men I have met, he seemed to possess more of the elements of greatness combined with goodness than any other." On April 2nd, the Confederate Army abandoned Petersburg, Virginia, and Richmond, Virginia. The capital had fallen. General, it finally happened. Grant had taken Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy. And President Lincoln decided to visit Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy that had fallen. He wanted to help with the process of restoring peace. So right away, he decided to visit Richmond, Virginia. Beforehand, on April 2nd, he rode over the Petersburg battlefields. There were still dead men and dying men still on the ground, and President Lincoln's face was a mask of sadness. David Balsinger and Charles E. Sellier, Jr., regarding President Lincoln in Richmond, Virginia on April 4th, wrote, quote, "Everywhere sullen white spectators thronged. Windows were crowded. Men clung to telegraph poles and trees to glimpse the president and his son, yet nobody made a sound. In the oppressive silence, nobody called out either in welcome or insult." So the Civil War was coming to an end. 60% of the Civil War was fought in Virginia. Now, before Richmond fell and before the Confederates withdrew out of Richmond, they decided to destroy all the whiskey because they were afraid that the Union troops would get drunk and go on a rampage like they had done apparently in Columbia, South Carolina, 2 months earlier. Now, so there was all this whiskey in the gutters of Richmond, and a lot of citizens went out and got drunk and were drinking out of the gutters, and that led to drunken mobs roaming the city. Tobacco warehouses were burned, and because they didn't want the Union to find those and sell the tobacco, the fires spread throughout the city. The Confederate Navy arsenal on the James River was also set on fire so that the Union troops could not capture that. So this led these fires that were set and these drunken mobs led to Richmond, Virginia really being destroyed and burned before the Union troops entered Richmond. President Lincoln wanted to defeat the Confederates, get them back to their homes. He wanted them to have their horses, the Confederate soldiers, to keep their horses to plow with on their farms and keep their guns to shoot crows with, to protect their crops on their farms at home. When President Lincoln got the news that Richmond, Virginia had fallen, he said, quote, "Thank God I have lived to see this. It seems to me that I have been dreaming a horrid dream for 4 years, and now the nightmare is gone." Now in Richmond, President Lincoln met a black woman who said to him, quote, "I know that I am free, for I have seen Father Abraham." A black man knelt before President Lincoln, and Lincoln said, quote, "Don't kneel to me. That is not right. You must kneel to God only and thank Him for the liberty you will enjoy hereafter." So this was the situation in Richmond, Virginia. The whites were depressed and that they were going to lose the war, and at the same time, blacks were celebrating. This was happening all over the South. White people being very unhappy, blacks being happy. Black families were starting to reunite. Folks separated by slavery, family members. There was a story of a black mother who had been separated from her son for 20 years, and they were reunited in Richmond when her son came as a chaplain with the U.S. colored troops. Now, during the occupation of Richmond, in the interest of reconciliation, the U.S. Army was restrained. Offensive words were prohibited. No insulting gestures were allowed. And there were no reports of Union rapes or break-ins or of sacking of houses. In Richmond, President Lincoln reached the mansion of Jefferson Davis, and an old black servant said, quote, Mrs. Davis had ordered him to have the house in good condition for the Yankees. At the same time, William Seward, the Secretary of State back in Washington, was in a very bad carriage accident. in which he had a broken jaw and a dislocated shoulder. Very, very tragic accident. On the train from Richmond to City Point, back to City Point, President Lincoln saw a turtle basking in the sun by the wayside, and he asked the train to be stopped. They brought the turtle into the train. The movements of the ungainly animal delighted President Lincoln. President Lincoln had visitors on a steamship on the Potomac River. They passed Mount Vernon, and one of the visitors was Marquis de Chambrun, a French visitor, who said, quote, "Mount Vernon and Springfield, the memories of George Washington and your own, the Revolutionary and Civil Wars. These are the spots and names America shall one day equally honor." It's true. George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, the two greatest American presidents. On April 4th, General Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army were in northern Virginia. They arrived at Amelia Courthouse, expecting to find a large supply of food. The Army was starving, the Confederate Army. There was no food there. There were only military supplies, so this was a disaster for the Confederate Army that was starving. April 5th, they marched to Danville, Virginia, 104 miles, and they were able to find there 1.5 million rations of food. April 7th, they arrived in Farmville, Virginia, and also found food. On April 7th, General Ulysses S. Grant wrote a letter to General Lee, and he believed that Confederate resistance was futile. He did not want, quote, "a further effusion of blood," and he hoped that General Lee would surrender. And he signed his letter very respectfully, "Your obedient servant, Ulysses S. Grant." You see the respect General Grant had for General Lee. And Lee's response that he was interested in General Grant's terms of surrender. On April 9th, Robert E. Lee's 8,000-man Confederate Army was surrounded by General Grant's 60,000 Union troops. And this was at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. April 9th, General Lee's Confederate Army of Northern Virginia was almost entirely surrounded, and there was a discussion between General Lee and his aide about the possibility of pursuing guerrilla war. Historian J. Winnick wrote, quote, "Robert E. Lee would alter the course of the nation's history for all time. It would constitute perhaps Lee's finest moment ever." The day after Richmond fell, Confederate President Jefferson Davis made a call for a shift to guerrilla war. And in effect, Davis ordered General Lee's army to be dispersed before they were captured. Now, back in 1864, 12 Confederate soldiers crossed from Canada, the border of Canada, into the United States. They robbed 3 Vermont banks and stole $210,000 and created chaos in Vermont. On April 9th, General Robert E. Lee met General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, to discuss the surrender of General Lee's army. General Lee was dressed very well, and General Grant not so well. President Lincoln's son was reportedly there in the room or in the house. Under the terms of surrender, General Grant allowed the Confederate troops to return home with their horses. On April 10th, there was a celebration in Washington, D.C., and this was basically leading to the end of the war. President Lincoln asked the military band to play Dixie, which was the popular song in the South. President Lincoln spoke to a crowd at the White House and said, quote, "Let us join in doing the acts necessary to restoring the proper relations between these states and the Union." Again, back at Appomattox Courthouse, President Lincoln's son was there, either on the porch or actually in the room when this historic meeting took place. After the surrender, General Lee was riding back to his men, and the Confederate troops lined the road, and General Robert E. Lee said, quote, "Men, we have fought this war together, and I have done the best I can for you." The men were cheering and crying. General Lee returned to his home in Richmond. Despite the severe hardships, the morale of the Confederate Army was kept high by the personality and good character of Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was exhausted in body, his heart was heavy, and he was troubled for the future of the South. Historian J. Winnick wrote, quote, "History is rife with lessons that how wars end is every bit as crucial as why they start and how they are waged." Now, regarding the surrender of the Confederacy, General Grant did not want to destroy the Ulysses S. Grant did not want to destroy the dignity of the South. There were generous surrender terms. They did have to surrender all their arms, weapons, and military supplies, but there was no prosecution for treason, and the men could keep their horses and their sidearms. At the surrender, General Robert E. Lee asked for food, and General Grant agreed to send 25,000 rations for the starving Confederate soldiers. General Grant, his military secretary, was Ellie Parker, a Seneca Indian. President Lincoln back in Washington, visited his Secretary of State, Seward, and he was very drained by seeing this man who had been very badly hurt. He was revived by the news of the surrender of General Lee. Now, when Lee surrendered, the Confederate troops by the side of the road paid their respects as he passed on horseback, and one of them said, quote, "I love you just as well, General Lee." So, big celebration in Washington City at the White House, the news of the surrender, and again, President Lincoln requested the band to play the song Dixie, and President Lincoln said, quote, "It is good to show the rebels that with us they will be free to hear that song again." That was the patriotic song of the South. Now, as the war was coming to an end, the morale in the Union Army was bad. In April 1865, there had been 200,000 Union deserters. Chief of the Cherokee Nation, Stand Watie, used guerrilla tactics as an officer in the Confederacy, and he was a military hero, another American Indian who fought in the war. And he was a Confederate brigadier general in the Arkansas River Valley. Now, in the Civil War, Missouri itself had an all-out, terrible civil war of its own. Guerrilla war, general terror, brutality, chaos. And there was fear that the whole country could become like that this end of the Civil War could degenerate into a terrible guerrilla war. And this would really destroy North and South. So this was one of the great thing that General Lee did. He decided to surrender and not pursue guerrilla war. General Lee said, quote, "It is our duty to live." General Robert E. Lee he and others among the Confederates were afraid that the surrender would lead to prison and execution. One newspaper in the North printed that Robert E. Lee should be hung to death. Again, this April 10th, big celebration in Washington, D.C. There were pistols fired, fireworks exploded, brass bands played, the church hymns sung, a 500-gun salute for the Army. Euphoria regarding the surrender of General Lee, after at Appomattox Courthouse, there was celebration there, and General Grant ordered it stopped. He did not want the Union troops to exult and humiliate the Confederates who were in mourning because they had lost. They were surrendering. Now, when General Lee surrendered, there were still 175,000 Confederate troops still in the field, so the war was not over. General Lee was determined to reunite America once he had surrendered. They both were magnanimous, Lee and Grant, at this time. Lee was very dignified. It was really a very beautiful scene, those two, when the surrender happened. April 12th, the arms of the Confederate troops at Appomattox Courthouse were surrendered. the Confederate flags were folded out of respect. There was mutual respect at that time between the Union Army and the Confederate Army at Appomattox Courthouse. During the Civil War, the Union Army had 216,000 troops, or 10% had been born in Germany. During the war, an estimated 400 to 700 women disguised themselves as men and served in the Civil War as soldiers. 175,000 Irish troops fought in the Civil War, 85% for the Union. In the Civil War, the South had 1 million men in the military. In the North, there were 2 million. There were 620,000 deaths on both sides from fighting and disease. More American deaths than the First World War, Second World War, Korea, and Vietnam Wars combined. President Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction, also known as reconciliation, he was a leader in total war, but also wanted a soft peace. By the end of the war, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee were under federal military control. President Lincoln's plan was that the Confederate states could return to the Union if 10% of the voting population would take an oath of loyalty to the United States. In the days after, several days after the surrender of General Lee, President Lincoln gave a speech to a crowd at the White House, and he talked about that it was an evening of gladness of heart. The war was not yet over, that there was a challenge of Reconstruction, and people had different ideas about Reconstruction. The crowd was disappointed. They wanted him to have some great victory speech. General William Tecumseh Sherman in North Carolina was communicating with Confederate General Joe Johnston regarding ceasing of the hostilities, and Sherman offered Johnston the same terms that Grant had offered Lee. And if they were accepted, then this really would go a long way to ending the war. They planned a meeting for April 17th. When General Robert E. Lee surrendered, there were other estimates, 146,000 Confederate troops from North Carolina to Texas who had not surrendered yet. Now, there were death threats against President Lincoln, who said, quote, "If I am killed, I can die but once, but to live in constant dread is to die over and over again." He really wasn't interested in having security. Now, there were some in the North who wanted to punish the South for the war. April 13th, General Ulysses S. Grant met President Lincoln at the White House. The two men rode in a carriage with the top down around Washington, D.C., and cheered for the two men. On April 14th, President Lincoln had a leisurely breakfast with his son Robert, who just arrived in Washington, D.C., and President Lincoln said to his son, quote, "Well, my son, you have returned safely from the front. The war is now closed, and we soon will live in peace with the brave men that have been fighting against us." President Lincoln knew that there were men in Congress who had hate and vindictiveness, and he was troubled by that. He did not want persecution of the South after the war. President Lincoln spoke kindly about General Robert E. Lee and others in the Confederacy. April 14th in the afternoon, Ulysses S. Grant, General Grant, attended President Lincoln's cabinet meeting, and President Lincoln asked General Grant the terms of the surrender of the Confederate troops, and General Grant said, quote, "to go back to their homes and families, and they would not be molested if they did nothing more." So both General Grant and President Lincoln wanted to be lenient toward the South when the war came to an end. Well, that concludes today's presentation. Good luck to you with your efforts in study of history. There's so many wonderful history books to read. You might consider checking out our website, Adventures in History with Peter J. Ray at peterjray.com. So far, we've made 733 history videos in 9 areas: world history, American history, book reviews, poetic tours, Cleveland baseball, family history, autobiography, and Cleveland basketball. There's a donate feature. You might consider making a donation to support this work. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.